I'm Dr. Craig Chalquist. I'm a professor at the California Institute of Integral Studies and also a graduate research advisor at several other schools. And I put this slideshow together to respond to a question that I'm asked more and more in my capacity as a depth psychologist trained in the traditions of Pierre Janet and William James and Sigmund Freud, C.G. Jung, Karen Horney, and others. And the question is, what archetype do I feel that we are all living in collectively in this time in human history? And my response is that I believe that we're in the archetype of the apocalypse. And so I thought it might be useful, given all the apocalyptic happenings of our day, from global warming to mass extinction to ceaseless warfare and the collapse of really key institutions in many different cultures. I thought it might be useful to explore what it means to live in the archetype of the apocalypse and what it might mean for us if we did it with more consciousness. So here's the table of contents for the slideshow. I want to start by going through some of the images of our time to see if we really do indeed find ourselves in an apocalyptic situation. I'd like to go a little bit further than that and develop what it means to live in an apocalyptic situation and what an apocalypse looks like both culturally and psychologically. And then tend the question of why they occur and how we can hold them in a more symbolic, psychological, metaphoric way rather than living them out literally and unconsciously. Then I want to look at some of the images of renewal that come up in our time as well, because an apocalypse isn't just about things breaking down. It's also about what's waiting on the other side. And you can think of an apocalypse as a situation of massive rupture in which new things are waiting to be born. So I want to look at some of those new things, including the image of Earthrise, as Joseph Campbell would put it, a possible mythic image for our time, a guiding image for us. I want to look at what it means to be in a conscious relationship to an apocalyptic time. And as part of that, I'd like to introduce an idea that I've started teaching in my graduate classes called Transrevolution, an evolutionary rather than a revolutionary process. And then I want to finish by saying a bit about my personal spiritual path, which is something that I have not done in public before. And my name for it is Terraspirituality, and I'd like to talk about that and what that has to do with both facing apocalypse consciously and with the time of renewal that I think is also at hand. So that's how I'd like to proceed. A few quotations to get us going. The first one by eco-psychologist Mary Gomes: "We're in the midst of a great dying," referring not only to mass extinction, but to the institutional collapses that we also see happening, and even the death of a mechanistic worldview. And the next one, Charles Dickens, some of you recognize this: "It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom, it was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief, it was the epoch of incredulity. It was the season of light, it was the season of darkness, it was the spring of hope, and it was the winter of despair." And then Arthur Miller: "There is a law in this disaster." And then Brian Swim: "Our challenge is to reinvent our civilization." And finally, James Hillman, the archetypal psychologist: "The world, because of its breakdown, is entering a new moment of consciousness." And these are a few quotations that, for me, really set the mood of the kind of time we're living in right now. So to start, if you follow the news at all, you're going to be aware of some aspect of this sixth mass extinction event that our planet is now undergoing. Unlike the other mass extinctions, it's not being caused by the Earth itself, it's being caused by us, by humanity. The extinction rates are easily 100 times more than the natural background extinction rates would be of species. And it's been estimated that if those don't stop, then within a few decades we could lose half the plant and animal life on this planet. It's important to recognize, too, that we're not excluded from the reckoning here. We're on that list, too. Climate change, of course, has been prominently featured in the news. I make a prediction sometimes in my classes that because of the obvious floods, superstorms, melting ice at the poles of the planet, and so many other things, they're happening in such rapid succession now that I would predict that within 5 years there will be virtually nobody who fails to recognize that we're in a period of global warming. You may have heard of the huge plastic island that's floating in the ocean. There's actually a few of these islands around the world. They're products of our waste. In permaculture, which has to do with designing food systems in a way that mimics how the natural world grows food, it's often said that you can tell when a natural cycle's been broken because waste is created. So these are areas where we need to learn how to get back in step with the rest of the natural world if we want to keep living on it. These sorts of cyclonic events are now called superstorms in the news, but they're not super anymore. They're super in strength and size, and they draw their energy from the huge amounts of heat in the atmosphere because of global warming, but they're normal now. They're our new norm. They're what we're going to face going forward. And it's sobering to think, too, that the extra heat in these storms is not... well, a couple of things about that. First of all, there's often a debate when a storm happens, is it driven by global warming or is it not? It's really the wrong question to ask. The question to ask is, to what extent is it being driven by global warming? Because they pretty much all are now. But another thing to bear in mind is that these big storms represent the excess carbon that went into the atmosphere 30 to 50 years ago. It takes about that long for the carbon to cycle through the atmosphere. So what we're seeing today, these storms that hover over entire continents, flood entire countries, represent the carbon that went into the atmosphere 30 to 50 years ago. Since then, the amount of carbon that's gone into the atmosphere has vastly accelerated, and it's continuing to do so. So we haven't seen anything yet. The pace of urbanization continues, swallowing incalculably vast resources, land, water, cropland that's being plowed under. And as part of this, I've noticed that for some years now, science fiction films have reflected the apocalyptic tone of this time that we're walking into. These are a couple of images from different periods of the White House being under attack by alien forces. I've noticed in my dreams and then those of my clients back when I did psychotherapy that sometimes aliens showing up in dreams have to do with what we're alienated from, the forces outside of us that are knocking on the psychic door, wanting our attention, wanting us to do something about them. The institutions of religion have been taking quite a beating for a long time now, actually. They're in a crisis of credibility at this point. And as that unrolls, atheism in some quarters becomes more and more aggressive, more and more outspoken. Our financial institutions represent the same. This is an image of the Assyrian bull god Moloch. The image in the upper left, he was a god Moloch, who was the Assyrian for sacrifices, and so the priests of Moloch fed. The Assyrian Empire, which usually militarily aggressive, began to decline because so much money was being spent like the bull god military adventures. But as the decline in fortune, the god accelerated in the Assyrian Empire, more and more people were sacrificed to that bull god. The empire had become fragile because constant military adventurism had deprived the empire of funds that it needed to maintain itself. A situation perhaps analogous to that of the United States in some ways. As this continues, the disparity of wealth grows exponentially. Since the 1980s, there's been a shift upward in wealth greater than any in the history of this country, and there's been similar developments in other countries as well, as more and more wealth becomes concentrated in fewer and fewer hands. When we begin to think of all the crises facing us from all different areas, it begins to become very overwhelming. Business, education, consumption, security, energy, transportation, religion, race relations, all of it seems to be on the brink of chaos. And the one thing we know about all of that, even if we don't know where it's all going to wind up, we do know this, that the natural world has the last word. And so we have the choice to try to align ourselves with it or go under. So I want to talk a little bit about what this means. If we really are in an apocalyptic time, not a literal end of times as some reactionary religious conservatives would put it, but an apocalypse more as an archetypal presence, more as the tone of the time that we live in. What does that really mean? I want to look into that a little bit. And it's important to remember that the old Greek word apocalypsis means to uncover what is hidden. And so it's intrinsic to an apocalypse that it comes at the end of a worldview or a series of worldviews that have exiled big portions of human experience. So I wanted to give you a few examples of that. These are all voices and presences that have been shoved to the margins of culture and consciousness, starting with the presence of the natural world, which we tend to see as either a backdrop to human affairs or something that we are the master of. And here's a few other examples. Direct spiritual experience not mediated by dogma. The capacity for intuition to know things that one cannot prove, but that nevertheless one does know. The voices of women, of course. Patriarchy is, at this point, 8 to 10,000 years old. Voices of people of color. Voices of the queer. Voices of the poor, the colonized. And this last phrase, one dimension too many, comes from Hermann Hesse's novel Steppenwolf, where Ermina, one of the characters, tells the protagonist, you are one of those exiles from life because you have a dimension too many. You're a little bit too conscious for your own good. So when we are in a situation of apocalypse, it tends to unfold in phases. If you look back through the history of other times of turbulence, there tends to be a lot of repressions of the kind that I just mentioned. That seems to be the mechanism that gets it really going. And then the reigning worldview begins to show cracks in it. And in between the cracks, both visions of doom and shifts in the collective mood, things become depressing or absurd. And representatives of the status quo, scientifically, educationally, politically, religiously, what have you, begin to be more and more strident and frantic as they try to cover up the cracks in the reigning worldview or views. And then when the apocalypse gets into full swing, whatever it is that's been repressed returns wildly and in full force. It breaks through the cultural defenses that kept it silent. And as this happens, the ruling gods, the ruling myths and principles and the dominant images of a time begin to die. This happens very often in religious systems where the old gods are replaced by new ones. I'm thinking of examples in Europe where my ancestors, who were pagans, worshipped gods that became smaller and smaller in mythology. They started out as powerful beings, and then they ended up being trolls and dwarves, and then they became fairy tale figures. With all this comes the collapse of key institutions across many different sectors of cultural life. And when the crisis reaches its maximum and things get still again, then there's a sense of renewal. There's a sense of new forces, new gods, new myths that come into prominence collectively. And so why do we have to go through this? Well, all worldviews wear out. And a worldview, if you think of it as a filter or as a framework that makes sense of ourselves and our place in the world, they can be either personal or collective. Either way, they eventually wear out as collective consciousness continues to move on and develop. The old beliefs, the old containers simply don't work anymore. So that's one reason. The ruling myths of a time, the ruling images and assumptions tend to wear out too. In our day, the myth of progress is taking quite a beating. It's becoming increasingly obvious that progress in some cases is actually regress. Apocalypses occur and accelerate when the kinds of leaders that a culture has are psychologically immature, impulsive, irrational, violent, short-sighted, bureaucratic, and materialistic. And it's even worse when the people that they lead are passive and feel helpless, taking up the child position of there's really nothing I can do about this, when the truth is that there's really nothing that's ever been done without the power of the people, ever. Patriarchy, of course, is a key dynamic of the apocalypse, always has been. And then the repression of dominant social forces is the very thing that leads to an explosion. If you want to strengthen something, if you want to make it powerful, then repress it, and it will be. Also, splits between inner and outer experience, especially when we try to reduce one to the other. And I'm thinking about my own field, psychology, where it's been popular, especially in the US, to explain the psyche or the mind as something that is secreted by brain cells. So it's an explanation that's entirely external and alienated. The other extreme would be to explain it only as inner experiences and to neglect neuroscience and all the other things that help us understand from the outside. And then finally, and this is a really key dynamic of the apocalypse, a lack of adaptation, both personal and cultural. And so we actually need a term for this, I think, and the term that I'm going to give it is apocalyptic failure, and it refers to what we saw in the first part of the slideshow with all those grim images. It's a breakdown at all levels. It's a breakdown across the board, not just in one discipline, one institutional area, one political area, or what have you, but it's apocalyptic failure is when they all break down at once, and that's the time that we're living in now. Eco-resilience is a term that we're using at CIIS, where I teach, to talk about the dynamic adaptability of culture, especially in terms of aligning itself with the natural forces of the earth. A system is eco-resilient when it's aligned, when it's in harmony with the earth, rather than fighting against it. And so a key law that shows an apocalypse after apocalypse is this: align with your time and place or die. And the history books are full of civilizations that forgot that law or never knew it to begin with. There's no such thing as a sustainable empire. Never has been. So a few quotations that describe this dynamic of the apocalypse. All the phenomena of the formation of symptoms may justly be described as the return of the oppressed. Freud was talking about something that happens inside the psyche, but his words are equally applicable to things that happen outside of it too, whether it's the force of nature or the people who are marginalized in a culture or any of that other list of things that we looked at earlier. The author Baxter Troutman puts it nicely and succinctly: our blood listens to what our minds won't hear. And Martin Luther King Jr., a riot is the language of the unheard. So here's one by Jung. The psychological rule says that when an inner situation is not made conscious, it happens outside as fate. By fate, Jung did not mean something that's written in the stars. What he meant was that if there's a situation developing and we only see the surface of it, we only see the outside of it, then we tend to fall into identification with it. So what we're seeing today is a literal apocalypse, or a whole series of them all over the world, instead of what could be primarily an apocalypse of internal renewal. So when we are called collectively or personally to make an underworld descent, to express it mythologically, to question and overturn the ruling principles that have guided us, to look once again and reimagine our relationship to each other and our planet and to ourselves. And in short, if we're in an apocalypse that could be dealt with socially and psychologically, but we fail to step up to it as an initiation, we fail to understand the lesson in it, then at that point, what could be a psychological, cultural, and spiritual apocalypse becomes a literal one, and therefore it becomes very dangerous. And when it's literal, it's unconscious, and we all get caught up in it. I have a couple of images here of teardrop shapes. When I was a boy, I had a really powerful dream, a big dream, in which I looked up at the sky at one point, and I saw spaceships, UFOs, and the entire sky was filled with them, and they were teardrop shaped, and they had Christian crosses on the belly of each one of them. And I remember the feeling of awe and terror I had both in the dream and when I woke up from it. And I didn't have the psychological language to understand it then, because I was very young and hadn't been exposed to any psychology. But as I look back on it, I think that that dream, and there are many people who have similar dreams or dreams with a different content but equally apocalyptic, I think that dream was landing in me in terms of what was going on in the collective. So it looked as though the sky were crying in the dream, and now, of course, the whole ecosphere is weeping as well. So this is not really uncommon. This actually happens to a lot of people, and I remember when I was doing therapy, I would occasionally have people come in who were having apocalyptic dreams or apocalyptic fantasies, or they would tell me, you know, these end of the world films, I just can't get enough of watching them. And am I crazy? And the answer is no, you're not crazy. You're sensitive. You're reacting to an actual apocalypse developing in collective consciousness. So here's an example of what I mean by an unconscious apocalypse that lives itself out literally. This river on the left is the Cuyahoga River. It's burned 13 times because of oil spills. And if we thought about it mythologically, and if we thought about myth not as something that stays in the myth books, not as an archaic explanation for weather, but myth that, like an apocalypse is a great example, as a dynamic that returns over and over again, and that's outside of us as well as inside of us, then the Cuyahoga River burning closely recalls Phlegethon, which in Greek mythology is the fiery river. And so our extractive industries that have, it's true, powered an entire civilization and given us transport and energy and clothing and agriculture, we have pushed them so far now, and they have eaten so much of the earth that wherever they flow, wherever the dark coal and the dark oil flow, now they recreate the underworld. And so some of you might remember that some years back Pluto got demoted as a planet, so it's not considered a planet anymore. And in a way, when Pluto vanished from the sky, it showed up on Earth. And so what we're doing and allowing it to be done actually is our upper world, our ecological world, is being turned into a plutonic underworld all around us. And of course, the word Pluto is where we get our word plutocrat. So an unconscious mythology that's lethal developing on every side. That's an example of one aspect of an unconscious apocalypse. And on that cheery note, I think it's time to go in another direction here and look at what can happen on the other side of an apocalypse? What's the renewal aspect? So you've undoubtedly seen this photograph. It's probably the most famous photograph in human history. It was taken in 1968 by Apollo 8, and it's an image, of course, of the Earth rising in space. And this image has been credited with starting the environmental movement all over the world. It actually didn't. Environmentalism goes far back. In fact, I even found a decree that the Emperor Tokugawa, the Shogun Tokugawa, excuse me, had issued in the 1600s forbidding any more cutting down of the forests in Japan. So this is an old battle. Plato talked about the stripping of Athens, the hillsides of Athens, of its trees as well. And as far as I know, Plato's the first person in the Western tradition to use the phrase Mother Earth. So Earthrise did not start the environmental movement, but it did announce it somehow. It's a collective image that galvanized millions of people. And so this is again an archetypal image, and this is what archetypes do when they're powerfully constellated. They are numinous. In other words, they have a strong psychospiritual charge. They get us going. They fascinate us. And Earthrise, I believe, is an example of that. It's interesting to me, too, that the reaction of the astronauts who took this picture when they first saw the Earth rising like this was not initially an objective, cold, impartial reaction, let's study it. Their reaction was actually aesthetic and heartfelt. They were amazed at the beauty of Earth. And the scientists today who visit the International Space Station have a term for this. They call it the overview effect. And what they mean by that is when an astronaut goes over to the window for a look at the Earth, and then before they know it, time is just flying by because they become utterly entranced with the beauty of our home planet. So in The Power of Myth film, in which Bill Moyers interviewed Joseph Campbell, they were talking about Earthrise, and Campbell suggested that this is actually a mythic image for our time, a source of new stories and new mythologies and a new worldview. And he said, this is the ground of what the myth is to be. When you see the Earth from the moon, you don't see any divisions there of nations or states. This might be the symbol, really, for the new mythology to come. I have a slideshow called Earthrise, Beacon of a New Worldview, and I developed this idea a bit further. It seems as though Earthrise has the potential for being the other side of the apocalypse, the image around which we can rally and that we can love and respect and take as a symbol of where we can go as a planet and as a species. So how to do an apocalypse consciously? Some suggestions. Letting go of failing institutions. I was having a conversation with somebody in my family who is rather conservative, which I don't tend to be. And yet we agree on a lot, actually. A lot of these issues that we face these days go far beyond party lines. It's ridiculous to think that they're confined to them. And so I was saying to this family member, isn't it odd that we think that institutions that were created in the 1700s to administer a country of about 2 million people would have any hope of dealing with the complexities of life in our time? Isn't that amazing? And he thought it was too. He agreed. So realizing what we need to let go of, realizing what we can't preserve, that's a big part of being conscious about all this. And incidentally, there's a technical term that Jung used to use when he saw his patients trying to scramble to get their lives back together and put their lives back the way they were before some great crisis, instead of using the crisis as an opportunity to move forward in a different way and to embrace a new kind of life. Jung called that the regressive restoration of the persona. The persona is our social self. It's the face that we wear in public. And so it's a natural reaction when that mask gets torn off to try to put it right back the way it was instead of coming up with a new way to adapt to our situation. We do that with Apocalypse too. If only we could make the banks honest. If only we could clean up the religious institutions and the churches. If only we could have finance be different than how it is internationally, and so on and so forth. That would be examples of regressive restoration. So telling and sharing new stories, and the Earthrise story might be an example of that too. Being able to reimagine our place on this planet. The universe story of Thomas Berry and Brian Swim would be an example of that as well. New ways to imagine things. Kenny Ossobel, the founder of Bioneers, made a comment in one of his books that we need a new creation story. Conscious apocalypse requires welcoming what has been cast out of collective consciousness. So the voices that I mentioned earlier, the voices of women, the voices of people of color, of people who are not heterosexual, the whole list of people that we've tended to exile from public discussion, all of that needs to be welcomed back, and also the voices of the natural world as well. And as part of that, the aesthetic dimension, the heartfelt dimension of actually appreciating the beauty of the earth, and I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment here. We desperately need to reinvent energy and transport. There's just no way around it. The systems that we use now, the extractive energy systems that we use, are imperiling all species on this planet, including our own. We simply have to give them up. There's really just no alternative. And I'll say a bit about this in a minute too. Trusting the order of the world, the intrinsic self-organization of the complexities of the world, instead of trying to impose schemas of authority and order on top of the world, which has been our way of doing it. How can we strengthen community? Community ultimately is the source of culture, and it's the safety net that holds all of us. And we're going to need it more than ever in the face of what's coming down the pike. Reconnecting with the natural world, having a conscious relationship with nature, and it is a relationship, and relationships take work and responsibility. Smart networking with our kindred, with people who support us, with people who have visions of good places to go in the midst of turbulence and chaos. People doing positive things to actually make their communities resilient. Those are the sorts of people we need to connect to and give voice to. Transrevolution, I'll explain in a moment also. It's my term for when a new system, a new complex system is born out of the ruins of an old one. So this is, again, the renewal part of Apocalypse. And I'll say a bit about Terraspirituality too. A spirituality of immanence and presence rather than belief in a world divorced from this world. Archon is an ancient term. I'm using it in the Gnostic sense. The Gnostics were spiritual seekers who began to organize into study and worship circles right before the birth of Christ. So they've been around a long time, very experientially spiritual people. And they use the term Archon to indicate the ruling powers of the world. The other term they had for Archon was the authorities of darkness. And so if you brought a Gnostic forward in time, then they would probably recognize some of these harmful institutions that are chewing up big pieces of the planet as recent examples of archons. And it really has gotten to the point where it's the archons or us. Somebody's got to go. If an institution is tearing big holes in the planet and jeopardizing species and making groundwater toxic and making the air toxic and overheating the planet, then clearly, as a matter of survival, pressure must be put on institutions like that to either evolve or go out of business. The way of dealing with an archon is to see through it, to have a conscious experience of apocalypse that allows one to step back and say, you know, these ruling powers, they really have to go. They have to do things differently, and we've got to make them. And I mean that in the sense of a peaceful search for alternatives so that we can get energy and transport and not be dependent on toxic sources of those things by these harmful institutions, these archontic institutions. So I wanted to include this quote from an essay by Alice Walker, and this was from a dream that she had back in the 80s. This two-headed woman was amazing. I asked whether the world would survive, and she said no. And her expression seemed to say, the way it's going, there's no need for it to. When I asked her what I or we could or should do, she took up her walking stick and walked expressively and purposefully across the room, dipping a bit from side to side. She said, live by the word and keep walking. Seems like good apocalyptic and post-apocalyptic advice. My appreciation of the world is increased when I think about how many patterns of order there are in the world. Nature has this marvelous, incredible capacity for taking relatively simple designs, like in this case a web, and weaving complexity and recycling the designs over and over and creating new things with them. It's just marvelous. This net pattern shows up, this web pattern shows up in all over the place, in the veins in your neck and and in your brain, the neurons that fire, branchings of trees and rivers. Also shows up a lot in mythology. The jeweled net of Indra, the web that's woven by Spider Woman. These, I think, would be good patterns to think about for building new kinds of culture. What are the archetypes found in nature that we can base new social forms on? That's an interesting question for me. This is a spiral pattern. Again, an archetypal pattern that shows up again and again in the natural world. Jung talked about the spiral in terms of the basic signature of individuation, of the growth of individuality, but also community as well. Science has also given us something called a strange attractor. It's been discovered first in mathematics and then in forms of experimentation that deal with order and chaos. That when you have something that seems to be random, seems to be just noise, then very often if you look at it or listen to it from a certain perspective, it reveals a sense of order. So within the randomness, there are basic shapes, basic forms, around which the behavior of the system gathers itself. And so you can think of a strange attractor as the part of a complex system that it works as its heart, its guiding vision, its core sense of itself. We could even call it its soul. And that brings us to Transrevolution. The birth of a new order of complexity, purpose, and meaning, whether small or large, from the remains of an outworn system. So as I mentioned earlier, it's an evolutionary rather than a revolutionary process. And it comes in here very appropriately because a time of apocalypse is a time of maximum cresting disorder. And of course, the usual approach to disorder socially is to try to impose order upon it. But Transrevolution suggests that there's a different way of looking at this, that we look for the strange attractors. We look for the archetypes, the images that are surfacing right in the midst of the rupture and disorder to see how they might be the outlines and the supporting structures for new systems of complexity. So these are all examples of transrevolutions that happened at different points in human history. So when you have a series of insights and they reorganize your life, that would be an example of a psychological transrevolution. Retooling a business to hold a progressive vision. I'm thinking of Ray Anderson's business interface and how he found himself identified, I forget who wrote the book, identified as a plunderer and polluter because of the ecologically dirty way that interface used to do business. And normally name calling like that isn't terribly effective, but in Ray Anderson's case, he actually took it to heart in spite of the name calling. And so he worked hard to retool his business and to get employees on board with what he was up to. And when he died a few years ago, the business was well on its way to becoming zero waste. So a transrevolution in the business world. the Renaissance. We usually think of it in the West as a European Renaissance, although it was Islamic cultural forces that paved the way for it. Depth psychology itself, with its emphasis on the psyche as an arena of self-organizing forces. That's a very transrevolutionary perspective. A key to transrevolutionary process has to do with the way systems naturally reorganize themselves. The term that's sometimes used for this biologically is autopoiesis. It's happening in science too with complexity theory. The women's movement is an example of a trans-revolution. So is the civil rights movement, the Green Belt movement in Kenya under Wangari Maathai, and permaculture, a design movement that uses systems principles to develop agriculture sustainably. Three core principles, core ethical principles of permaculture are care of the earth, care of people, and fair sharing of surplus. It's a view that's oriented toward abundance rather than scarcity. So it seems to me, as I look back through history and I consider different examples of transrevolution, that there's 12 basic phrases. I'm not going to read these in detail. I'm just going to touch on them briefly. You can rewind the slideshow to get the more detailed picture of this. But the guiding assumption right at the beginning is that, as Fritjof Capra pointed out in some of his books, it's more useful to think of a complex system as a basic pattern of organization rather than just as a collection of hard elements. Obviously, it contains the elements, whether that's parts in a machine or nerve cells or human beings in a complex social system. But in systems theory, the emphasis is on the interactions between the elements. That's a paradigm shift. So we mentioned this one earlier in a different form. I was saying that it's necessary to, in order to be consciously apocalyptic in perception, to let go of things that need to be let go of that are dying. This trans-revolutionary aspect of this would be understanding when a system cannot change, when a system will not change, and when it can't change, it's doomed, because it's of the nature of living systems that they have to periodically reinvent themselves, partly through feedback from other systems, and when they've lost the capacity to do that, they're dead. And so out of the wreckage and out of the rupture emerges some new strange attractor, some new image or vision or hope or myth. Myth in the sense of a guiding image, guiding collective image, or a guiding story. And it really catches people. That's how you know that it's archetypal. It really gets into people, like the Earthrise picture did for millions of people who saw it. And so as numbers of people get caught by the vision and they start resonating to it, they begin to find each other and talk about it. And this is actually, these connections between people, they form the framework of a new form of culture. And so eventually these people become representatives of this new form of culture, and as they share it with other people, then they gather up those who resonate in a common effort. And these days, one of my guiding mottos is that last piece at the bottom: if you can't beat them, transform them. As an educator, I see that all the time. As this proceeds and the new strange attractor finds expression, a diversity of information channels spreads the ideas that are connected with it. It's important to have as many different diverse information channels as possible, a variety of media. And these days the internet and phones and all the other media that we use are really great examples of that. Parallel institution is a term that's used for an organization that does something better than an official organization does. And I often think of Dominic Barter's work in restorative justice in South America. He was in a village that was suffering from a great deal of violence, and the police and the courts were totally overwhelmed. And so he began bringing people together such that instead of just trying to lock them up or cast them out of the village, they were resolving their problems by talking about them in face-to-face interaction. And he was so successful that the courts and the police began sending people to him whenever something would come up in the community, some problem rose or a crime was committed or what have you. So another example of a parallel institution would be community-supported agriculture. So anytime that a group of people gets together and says, you know, we could actually do this better than the current system, that's when a parallel institution is formed. So if there's enough of these at any one time, all centered around the guiding strange attractor that's surfacing from apocalyptic rupture, then they begin to develop new subsystems, new structures, new frameworks. And there's a term that we're starting to use at CIIS in conjunction with a certificate that we're developing in eco-resilience leadership. And the term is heartstead as opposed to homestead. And a heartstead is basically a wisdom and problem-solving group, not just a support group, although it includes that, but something that actually creates new experiments in culture, new solutions, and generates knowledge that can be pooled and shared with other heartsteads. So we're interested in seeing how that can develop. Donella Meadows, the systems expert, used to talk about facing reactionary opposition, and her advice was don't waste too much time on it. Just primarily focus on the success stories of what the new subsystems and the new frameworks and the new memes are up to. And so finally, a new system, a new form of culture emerges from all this chaos, and it consolidates itself. And as it does, it continues to self-examine and reflect, keeping what was useful under the old systems, but also getting rid of what wasn't useful. This last stage, almost no movement reaches, although a few have come close to it. It's difficult, especially during turbulent times, to remain in permanent critical self-reflection, but it's the only way ultimately a system has the resources to adapt itself to changing times. So that's Transrevolution. And a couple of appropriate quotations to go with it. This is from my colleague Linda Buzzell. The redesign of every sector of society to be compatible with the rest of nature and nature's laws is the great work of our era. That goes way back to Hildegard of Bingen. One of the exciting things about living in an Earthrise time is that it lets us rely on old sources of wisdom and put them in relation to new ones, so we can redream them, we can update them and bring them forward and see how relevant they still are. A good example of this is this quote from the mystic Hildegard of Bingen. The soul is the greening life force of the flesh, for the body grows and prospers through her, just as the earth becomes fruitful when it is moistened. The soul humidifies the body so it does not dry out, just like the rain which soaks into the earth. This is Thomas Berry. He called himself a geologian. I like that. The universe is a communion of subjects, not a collection of objects. And this goes all the way back to the Gnostic Gospels. Sophia is the goddess of wisdom. And the old stories tell us that at one point the goddess of wisdom lived in what the Gnostics called the eighth realm of heaven, and looked down and saw her own light in the waters below and joined with them, and this is what created everything. And so, as Jeff Raff points out, Sophia can be thought of actually as the anima mundi, the soul of the world. And I really like this last quotation. When the light of this Sophia had mixed with the darkness, it caused the darkness to shine. Beautiful quote for an apocalyptic time. So a bit about Terraspirituality and its place in consciously facing apocalypse. I coined a word several years ago, Terra psychology. And Terra psychology is the study of the presence of the places where we live, and the presence of the things in them, the materials, the creatures, even the buildings, and of course the landscapes and the elements, as we interact with them in very deep ways. That sense of presence is one of the voices that has been silenced in the dominant culture. And so those of us who do parapsychology have explored ways of listening. And so to give you a very simple example of what parapsychology is, the parapsychological move would be something like this, that as I speak to you here, I'm in the Bay Area. And so the Bay Area is the largest estuary on the west coast of North America. And an estuary, understood ecologically, is an edge place. It's a place where saltwater and freshwater come together, and where species come together that never would have met each other anywhere else. It's a place of enormous productivity. Sometimes we think of edge places as mere wetlands that we need to pave over, but we've learned ecologically that we shouldn't do this because of the fantastic growth and productivity and the filtering that they do of toxins. So they're edgy places. They're places that are creative and cosmopolitan and diverse. So the parapsychological move is to ask, in what way is an estuary not only an ecological reality, but also a psychological and spiritual and cultural reality too? In what way is the Bay Area an estuary of culture, an estuary of spirit, an estuary of new movements? And just a glance at the history of the Bay Area answers all of those questions. So parapsychology isn't really about the old proof paradigm or anything like that. It's about trying on a new lens and a new set of interpretive tools and seeing just how it is that we're always in the contours and discourse of the places where we are, and therefore not separate from them. So parapsychology suggests that dualism between place and persons and between mind and outer reality is false, and that actually the place itself, the presence of places and creatures and materials, are overcoming that dualism all the time. Some of us do dream work to find out what's happening in a particular place. I very often, when I was exploring California, my homeland, from a parapsychological perspective, right before I would drive somewhere, I would have a dream that would tell me something about the ecology of the place. The unconscious mind is very sensitive to field effects from the outside of it, and so this could actually be quite useful in many ways. So I'm mentioning all this in part because I think it's a good tool for conscious apocalypse and coming up to renewal. But some time ago, some of my students suggested that parapsychology is actually also a spiritual path. And I had been using it as one for a long time without really thinking much about it. And so I recently decided that I wanted to develop it as a spiritual path. And so I wanted to tell you a little bit about it. It's just my own way of walking. I don't say this to you in the spirit of trying to convert you to it or anything like that. I think conversion and that whole missionary mentality is part of what got us in disaster in the first place, actually. So a couple of things about it. Terraspirituality is a spiritual path that emphasizes loving Earth and all the other divine powers of the cosmos, not as worshipful children bowing down to them, but as psychological adults engaged in an ongoing conversation with these powers. I've sometimes wondered if the gods prefer appreciation to worship. So as part of this, Terraspirituality has no clergy or hierarchy or sacred book or any of that, no dogma. There's no submission, there's no self-silencing, and there's no need to feel perennially guilty. And the congregation of Terraspirituality is everything living on the planet, so it's not restricted to the human realm. Incidentally, there's a movie called Baraka that at the very beginning shows an ape sitting in a hot pool of water, a hot spring, and looks for all the world like he's meditating. So Terraspirituality holds forth the idea that perhaps other forms of life on this planet have spiritualities that are different from ours, but nevertheless spiritualities, some connection with the divine. Our temple is Earth and the sacred sites of the Earth, and Holding things this way allows us to put old and new knowledge together instead of trying to kick one form of knowledge out. We aim for a non-assimilative valuing of indigenous traditions. In other words, we don't feel we have permission to take over indigenous knowledge. It belongs to the people who created it. So what we can do is exist in a relationship of respectful dialogue with it, and from its inspiration come up with our own traditions on our own forms of knowledge, embodied knowledges of dwelling in specific places on the earth. And we also hold diversity as basic to existence. Whether we talk about diversity as biodiversity, whether we talk about it as cultural diversity, ontologically it comes to the same thing, that it's good. That the more diversity we have, the more health we have, the more wisdom we have, and the more connection that's conscious we have to our homeworld. And one task of Terraspirituality is to reimagine the images and containers, to use a psychological term, for the sacred powers, for the gods. Because very often, as Jung taught us, there are forms of expression in old traditions that simply don't work for us. Eventually, all psychic containers wear out, and so that's when very often somebody realizes that they're in spiritual crisis, because the official way that they're taught to think about God or to think about spirit simply doesn't work for them anymore. And it isn't that they don't want that relationship, it's that they don't know how to put it into a new container. I always think of the parable of Jesus about trying to put new wine into old wineskins and how it just bursts them. So Jung talked about the need to dream the myth onward by giving it a modern dress. And so Terraspirituality encourages an ongoing inquiry about what masks do the gods want to wear today. And one of those masks is perhaps that they take the form of the sacred powers of the earth, rather than being divorced from it, rather than being a world that's apart or above the earth, but that we are actually inside the gods. And there's a word that drifted into my consciousness some time ago, Terrania. And when I think of this word, I think of the possibility of a just, earth-loving, locally rooted, but globally reaching form of human civilization that would truly be civilized, that would truly be a set of communities that we enjoy belonging to, that really would value equality and justice. And so a few more quotations along Terraspirituality lines. This is from Pierre Terre de Chardin. Throughout my whole life, during every minute of it, the world has been gradually lighting up and blazing before my eyes until it has come to surround me, entirely lit up from within. Another quotation from Alice Walker. I had assumed that the spirit of the earth noticed exceptions, those who wantonly damage it and those who do not. But the earth is wise. It has given itself into the keeping of all, and all are therefore accountable. We are not separated from spirit, said Plotinus. We are in it. And so I'd like to end with a recap. Doing Apocalypse consciously. These are some of the guiding questions that might come in useful during turbulent times. What do you need to let go of? What isn't serving you anymore? Either personally or collectively. What new stories resonate with you? What that's been cast out can you welcome home again? And also, who can you welcome home again? How to let in Earth's beauty, to let it really have a full transformative effect on the heart. In times of rupture, we tend to be very defended against letting in things that transform us. This calls for the opposite reaction, a certain moral courage to let things transform us, affect us. How will we help protect the earth? How can we learn to trust the intrinsic order of things? Where is your link with nature? What new attractors now arise for you? With whom, with what kindred shall you tend them? Who are our elders, the wise ones who can help us be initiated into full adulthood? And how do we reach that true adulthood? And one last quotation. Jung's Red Book was distilled from his journals that he wrote during a time of tremendous internal upheaval. And during those years, Jung used his technique of active imagination to engage with imaginal figures who would say things to him that were often unexpected. And this taught Jung about the diversity of the psyche, that the psyche is a place of many different powers, not just a single ego enthroned and overlooking everything. And so one of those powers, Jung took the classical name Philemon. He was a wise, trickstery figure that would show up and he would instruct Jung about what Jung called psychic reality, the reality of the psyche. And so in the Red Book, Philemon predicts a time of huge earthly destruction and hardship, but then the time passes. And so this is what Philemon says: the earth became green and fruitful again from the blood of the sacrifice. Flowers sprouted, waves crash into the sand, a silver cloud lies at the foot of the mountain. The stones speak, and the grass whispers. And so if you want to hear any more about Earthrise and the implications of it, if you want more about Transrevolution or Terraspirituality, and if you want a copy of this slideshow and some training in how to use it, feel free to email me at this email address. Thank you very much.